My name is David Hyvee. I am the Society's treasurer, and I want to welcome you to our meeting of September the 25th of 2024. Our president, Pam Cressy, is out of town, but she does send her furloughs. Did I say that right? Must be the, I am fighting a cold, and I have all these pills in me, so if I say words wrong, you understand, right? You know, we've all been there. Before we begin, I'd like to share some information about our next meeting, which is in October, which will not be held here. It's going to be held at the Lloyd House at 220 North Washington Street, and that's because they're going to be doing some renovations in this building. So this place will not be accessible. So don't show up to this place next in October. Our speaker will be Char McCargo Ba. I'm sure many of you know her. She's an expert on Alexandria's African American history and genealogy. She's going to discuss her most recent work, which is Searching for the Enslaved, those held in bondage by George Mason IV. It's going to be an exciting program. But she has decided that she does not want this recorded. So this is going to be a unique event. It's going to be a live-only presentation. So if you want to hear the presentation, you have to show up and be there in person. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce to you tonight's speaker, Madeline Fierstein. I've worked with Madeline over the past year as a member of the Lee Findlehouse Board of Directors. And we have collaborated on tours of the Wilk Street Cemetery Complex, focusing on individuals buried there who lived in or owned the Lee Findlehouse before it was a museum. She is a historian at the Lee Findlehouse Museum with a background in criminology. She specializes in the history of the Civil War in Alexandria and leads projects documenting the sick and injured soldiers treated in the city's wartime hospitals and prisons. She created the popular Civil War hospital tour, giving engaging lectures on Alexandria's history. Her work has been recognized both locally and at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine in Frederick, Maryland. In addition to her work at Lee Findlehouse, she also works with me on my website, Gravestone Stories, which I founded to talk about Alexandria cemeteries. And her dedication to uncovering and sharing Alexandria's past makes history accessible and engaging for our entire community. When she's not immersed in history, guess what she's doing? She is a full-time history teacher in a high school in Fairfax County. So, you know, history is in her blood, as you can tell. This December, she'll be completing her master's in American history from Southern New Hampshire University. I've had the opportunity to preview Madeline's presentation for tonight. I can assure you that it's nothing short of perfect. So, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Madeline.
Well, thank you so much, Dave, for those introductions, and for you guys coming out on a rainy Wednesday at 7 o'clock. I was teaching up until 4:30, so I feel some of the exhaustion pain. Really happy you guys were here. Let me go ahead and skip to welcome. Okay. So again, thank you for coming. The purpose of tonight's lecture is to examine the role that prison facilities and the confinement of prisoners played during Alexandria's occupation by Union forces in the Civil War. We will discuss each prison in detail, ascertaining the daily life of those imprisoned within the city walls, directly from the prison reports, as well as indirectly from newspaper announcements and diary entries. We will shift perspective to the civilians of the city and how they reacted to being under the command of a military government, sworn by tens of thousands of soldiers over the course of the war, and home to dozens of makeshift hospitals. Fun fact, I'm also completing my master's thesis on a very similar topic, kind of analyzing the management of Alexandria during the Civil War and how the military government was able to do such a feat, or if they didn't do a good job. Okay. So, why talk about military prisons? Like the general study of the Civil War, it's a subject we think we know all about. Like other aspects of the Civil War, it's a widely misunderstood topic as well. My reasoning for hyper-focusing on such a macabre topic is partly due to this simple question. How did our fine city of Alexandria fare with 5 military prisons within the confines of Old Town? It would have stood out the same in 2024 as in 1861. It's like putting a pop-up prison next to Il Porto Ristorante on King Street. Look very out of place. So let's first establish what we mean by military prison and why one would be sent there. So here we have Libby Prison, which many of you are familiar with in Richmond, It's an example of a built prison. This one was constructed for the purposes of being a prison. Repurposed. So Point Lookout in Maryland on the eastern shore was a lighthouse. You can actually see the lighthouse right there, and then all this was built behind it because it was a great location to transfer prisoners of war and Union prisoners. This is the one I call fashioned out of thin air. So a lot of you are familiar with its more informal name, just Andersonville, but Camp Sumter in Georgia was one of the most notorious prison camps in the Civil War. It was basically a pit that was fenced in. And as you can see, unfortunate for these guys, the latrines were right next to, of course, housing and food supply. Very crude. And then we get Alexandria. I love this photo. It's one of my favorite photos. This is now an apartment building. And on the ground floor is a parking garage. And this was the Green Furniture Factory owned by the Green family of Alexandria. We'll touch on them later. Confiscated. This is our other version of a military prison, the ones we are going to be seeing here tonight. So this great map from the Andersonville National Historic Site shows 16 total prisons between the north and south. Alexandria is not listed due to two main purposes. One, it was used to usually house disorderly prisoners who'd be held for a short period of time, and it acted as a transfer station to move prisoners up north. So they'd be sent to more permanent prison like Camp Chase in Ohio, Elmira in New York, or Point Lookout in Scotland, Maryland. We're not set up to permanently house thousands of POWs here, but because of our location conveniently in between the Union and Confederacy, we were used for transfer. Within the area, there were 7 total prisons. The Supreme Court is pinpointed on this map because it stands on the ground of the old Capitol Prison, which was the only Civil War prison in D.C. So before the war, it served as a temporary location for the Supreme Court, and then that building was demolished in 1929 to make room for the lovely Supreme Court building we see today. Point Lookout is the next closest prison, and then we would go probably to New York State and Ohio for the next. So it really shows how Alexandria was important as a transfer site and a temporary holding tank for these prisoners who didn't really know what their future meant. They didn't know if they'd be staying in Alexandria for long or where they'd be going next. Why? Why are these guys being imprisoned here? Number one, in Alexandria, disorderly conduct. You're fighting with a fellow soldier. You're drunk. Or you're having threatening behavior. Desertion. So this is actually quite common during the Civil War, and it's not as negative as kind of we put it today. This was extremely common. They may leave the regiment while in camp or during battle. They may walk away from hospitals. They may be done with medical treatment and just walk out the front door, but be determined as deserted. And you also could be classified as deserted if you're suspected of desertion, but there's no any kind of cause for that. And we're going to talk about those guys later on too. All right. Alexandria has a long-standing history, and it's one of the most historic areas in Northern Virginia. That's why you guys are here today. It was very active in the slave trade, with several slave auction houses and slave pens within the city limits. It was a transport region to send newly purchased enslaved people to their new work sites and lives in the Deep South. And a temporary Confederate government at the turn of 1861 through Virginia's secession. May 23rd, Virginia ratifies secession. They're gone. May 24th, the next day, Union troops march across the Long Bridge, no longer exists. They occupy Alexandria for the duration of the war. The citizens are under martial law and the command of a military government. We are the first Confederate city to be seized and occupied in the course of the war. All right, so we see here, of course, we have some characteristics. We have a bunch of forts. There's going to be about 25 by the time the war is over. Okay, this is where the Masonic Memorial is today. Just trying to give you guys some context there, and there we are. We also had an extensive rail network, of course, that the Union is going to want to exploit and use because we can ship soldiers and goods faster and quicker than the Confederacy. And, of course, being close to Washington, D.C., we have a job to do. We are going to be a buffer between the Confederacy and D.C. We're going to reroute the Confederate Army northward to try and get to D.C., leading to battles like Antietam and Gettysburg. They could not break through our forces. We were on lockdown mode. All right, so here's some examples. Kind of overlooking Alexandria, some soldier tents here, and the Provost Marshal's office. We're going to talk about this guy a lot today. All right, I love this picture. This is the, I never say this right, Athenaeum, right? Yeah, I never say it right. This is the Athenaeum, which was, during the Civil War, the commissary, where you'd buy your foods and goods. So I just think it's such a stunning picture of these folks gathered on the steps there. Start with General John Potts Slough. He was the military governor since 1862. He took over for General William Montgomery, who was considered ineffectual and not heavy-handed enough. They actually were two intermediate governors between Montgomery and Slough, who both just kind of gave up and resigned from the position for one reason or another. So already off the bat, Alexandria is having some management issues. He was the Brigadier General of Volunteers. He established the Contraband and Freedom Cemetery. He ordered the vaccination of contraband refugees. And we see here, from the Alexandria Gazette on August 25th, 1862, he had been assigned to the duty as military governor of Alexandria, announcing it. Now, the Alexandria Gazette was a go-to here in the city. It's the best way to tell civilians what's going on in Glen. All right, here is Henry Horatio Wells. He became the provost marshal in 1863. He led law enforcement efforts and was in charge of the military police. He was also in charge of signing passes into D.C. You could not just go to the nation's capital at this time, even if you were in Union-occupied territory, even if you were the most ardent ardent Unionist ever to be in Alexandria. You still needed to have a pass that says you are on a mission, you have a purpose for entering the nation's capital. National security measures at the time. So here we see from the Alexandria Gazette what he's in charge with. Prisons and prisoners. Grand River Prison, other guards, deserters, stragglers, smugglers, passes. He's also in charge of retaining the control of contrabands, sanitary conditions of the city, liquor permits, the military police and patrols, order of the city, civil duties, and command of troops for defense. Wow, this guy has a big job ahead of him. So he's going to show up a lot today. All right. Colonel Gabriel de Courtenay, I believe I'm saying that correctly, has vague origins. He was probably Hungarian or Polish, but as we know, those borders tended to shift a lot. He commanded the paroled prisoners and prisoner exchanges for Alexandria starting in 1862. So he was in charge of, guess what, Camp Parole, which was when a prisoner would be released from any of the prisons. They have like this little camp. Then they'd be sent back to the regiment or maybe reassigned if their group is just too far gone, they're too far into Virginia fighting, we're going to get you a new job type of thing. For some reason, he's credited with bringing the polka to the United States. So we're going to take that with a grain of salt. And we have a wonderful, wonderful source from Julia Wilbur, who came from New York as a volunteer to help out in our hospitals. Not saying really good things about him. So we see starting here, Colonel K has addressed his men in language half profane, half sacred, at once solemn and ludicrous. He reminded the men of their day, of their homes and their families, and although he could not do anything in particular for them, he asked them earnestly to behave themselves. Now, we're not sure who this Mr. W is, but Mr. W gives an instance which illustrates his character. He said, and excuse my language, that's not mine, he says, "Damn it, if I hear any of these men swear, I'll do so and so." And today, as he entered the door, I heard him swear. So that says a lot about this man's character, doesn't it? All right. Captain Rufus D. Petit, he's not a very good guy. I'll just say that right off the bat. He had served with the 1st New York Light Artillery. After the Battle of Chancellorsville in May of 1863, he resigned due to medical reasons and went home to New York for 1 year before re-enlisting with the Veteran Reserve Corps. This was a group of soldiers who were unfit to return to the front lines, return to active duty. So instead, they were in administrative positions. Hospital stewards, guards, just anybody that's not in active battle. On July 20th, 1864, he was assigned superintendent of the Union prisons in Alexandria. While superintendent, he earned a notorious reputation as a cruel warden and often was called sadistic. This newspaper clipping foreshadows later events. We see that he was court-martialed for the trial of Captain Petit. a series of cruelties and frauds perpetrated by him while he was in commandant of the jail in Alexandria, Virginia. Edwin Stanton, Lincoln's Secretary of War, also had some kind words to say. Petit was worthy of the Spanish Inquisition in its palmiest days and was as murderous as the commandant of Andersonville. Yikes, not a good endorsement for Captain Petit here. Okay, Dr. Bentley is near and dear to our hearts at the Lee Bendel House. He was our head surgeon. Connecticut-born surgeon with a private practice, he enlisted in the 1st Connecticut Heavy Artillery in 1861. He didn't have to do that. He could have just joined the Union cause. He could have just been a regular private surgeon that didn't have to enlist. But when he enlists, he earns the rank of major right off the bat. Fortunately for Dr. Bentley, he's captured at Gaines Mill in 1862, and he's imprisoned at Libby Prison in Richmond. While he's there, he is treating Union soldiers, and he's kind of like a hot commodity there. So when he is traded, he's traded for several Confederate privates because he's kind of like a high-ranking officer there. So once he left Libby Prison, he made his way to Alexandria, and his first job was to be in charge of the 3rd Division hospitals. There were 3. You can consider them like neighborhoods where the hospitals would be kind of like regional districts where hospitals would kind of gather. And then eventually he made his way to be in charge of all of the military prisons here in Alexandria, worked his way up. So we see here, he was so loved that he was presented by the stewards, attendants, and patients in that hospital as a mark of respect and esteem with a gold watch and chain. Well, Julia Wilbur had something different to say about him. She writes later in May of 1864, "We hear that there has been fighting today near Chancellorsville. I am told that 25,000 cots are ready in Washington for the wounded. There is a general complaint against Dr. Bentley, and Miss Dix thinks he is a brute. How unfortunate it is that so many are under his charge, and that our hospital is in his division." Poor Dr. Bentley. This is his wartime image, by the way, taken when he enlisted. Okay, now let's get into our prisons. We're going to move into discussing each of the 5 prisons here in Alexandria during the war. A responsibility of the superintendent of U.S. military prisons was to record monthly reports for each facility. Captain Petit left behind a treasure trove of information in his archive at the Alexandria Special Collections Library. I have selected excerpts that are shocking, surprising, comforting, or a combination of both. Petit's admission or omission of certain information is quite telling. He conducted these reports every 10 days from August 1864 to May 1865. I will also include contemporary maps drawn for the quartermaster's office that are held at the National Archives in College Park, and the order of prisons is based on their intensity and available records. St. Asaph's Street Jail, which we know as the Sheriff's Office, there used to be a jail at the Market Square by the wharf, where the flea market is now held today. That became too overcrowded, so it was moved to Wolf Street. When that became too overcrowded, a new city prison was commissioned in 1827 at the corner of Princess and St. Asaph Street, where it is today. There was no official name for this facility, so most just called it the City Jail. Construction was led by Charles Bulfinch, considered the first American-born architect and designer of the central dome of the U.S. Capitol building, among many other notable works. This map details the prison and any surrounding facilities or buildings of note. The floor plans are to scale, but as you can see, some of the drawings are a little over-proportioned. That's just to show the details of what was there for the viewer. And then here's a rotated image of that floor plan as if you're walking on St. Asaph Street. Most maps will note the presence of a sink, guardhouse, or barracks on the site itself. So this prison is actually quite small in comparison to the other 4 we're going to talk about today. We can gather what daily life would have been like for prisoners held at the city jail. In this portion of the prison report from August 10, 1864, Petit writes, "This prison is in excellent condition, the prison presenting a very clean and comfortable appearance. In fact, everything connected with the prison is entirely satisfactory, except for the present manner of paying the rent and cooking the food, which is now contingent upon the number of prisons combined." So it's doing great, except they can't pay for it and there's no food available. There are a total of 297 prisoners, 5 of which are receiving medical attention. And we can also see that no one has been sent to the hospital or escaped in the last 10 days. So that's a pretty good record there. This building at 218 North Columbus Street was featured in the 2010 issue of the Alexandria Times Out of the Attic. It is a relatively new property for Alexandria. So the Independent Order of the Odd Fellows acquired it in 1841 and constructed the property. Renovations were added, including a second floor in 1846. The Mount Vernon Guard, which was a local militia unit, held their meetings here. I particularly like this clipping from June 1st, 1864, because it talks about a number of citizen prisoners coming from Stafford, Culpeper, Fauquier, and Rappahannock counties. So this prison in particular, we know from this clipping, held a lot of citizen prisoners, which was the thing during the Civil War. You can see on this map that the prison is surrounded by barracks and also special barracks set aside for officers. And then here, of course, this rotated image, we can see the meticulous tracking of all sheds and yard space. Many of the barracks listed on these maps were added onto existing buildings like wooden extensions. So, kind of like these ones were added on the back side. So you can see the stairs there. The August 20th prison report explains that this prison has been much improved since the last inspection, having been whitewashed and the required privy nearly completed. Also, a room has been provided for the prisoners to wash their persons and clothing. So before August 20th of 1864, there was no bathroom, but now they kind of have one. We know here that there was one prisoner who has escaped, but there is no mention of how. Before the war, the property of 200 South Fairfax Street was owned and manned by a man named James Green. The Green family was featured in the PBS series Mercy Street, which depicts Civil War Alexandria. In the show, it portrays how Green's Hotel, which was requisitioned as Mansion House Hospital, and what we don't see, though, is the confiscation of the furniture factory. Now, the furniture factory is featured in the show as part of the plot, but his furniture factory was taken as a prison. The Greens were quite wealthy and owned a number of furniture factories around the area. We have some green pieces actually at the Fendel on display. So pictured here is also a screenshot from Mercy Street, where it shows James on the right walking with his son Jimmy. And I like it because it shows this guy, which was what daily life was like in Alexandria under occupation. It shows how so many buildings were repurposed for government use that you would see sentinels all the time. This would be so common during the war. On September 10, 1864, we are told that the details about the 522 prisoners' diet and illnesses. This prison is very well managed, being kept clean, and its premises well policed. The prisoners were kept as clean as circumstances will allow and are under good discipline. Provision has been made in compliance with your direction for the military governor, your direction for prisoners suffering from scurvy, and they are now furnished with tomatoes, onions, and potatoes. Yum. I'm glad these guys get food because the other guys did not. 10 days later, the report from September 20th lists among its 479 total prisoners one daring escape. We see details of this incident written here by Petit. The escape mentioned was due to the carelessness of the sentinel while on duty, but from what I know of the man, I do not think he purposely allowed the prisoner to escape, but the soldiers should be punished for dereliction of duty. How nice. In November, we do not get an explanation for the two escapees, but we may have a reason for it. This prison is not in its usual fine condition, owing to the absence of Lieutenant Roberts, whose familiarity with the details for its management render his services desirable. In addition to Petit's data, the Alexandria Gazette reported several instances and incidents that were worthy to inform the public. So, for example, we see here from May 27, 1864, some 300 deserters from the Federal Army have been placed in confinement in the Fairfax Street prison in this place. And then a few months later, a soldier confined at the U.S. military prison, corner of Prince and Fairfax Streets, was shot at and killed by the guard on Wednesday morning for refusing to obey orders about his removal from the windows, etc. A soldier near the U.S. government bakery on Tuesday night was severely wounded by the guard whom he had assaulted. My goodness, could you imagine living down the street and reading this about your neighborhood and being like, what is going on here? Okay. The property at 315 Duke Street has a long history of ownership and purposes. The most notorious use of this building was as a slave auction house and holding pen for enslaved people being transported in and out of the city. It was famously the Franklin and Armfield office, which we can see an advertisement for their business up here. After changing hands a few times in that industry, when Union troops confiscated the building, it was run by a group of associates we refer to as Price, Birch, and Company. You can see their name here. So these are wonderful wartime images of that building. A differing map shows the prison in purple and the red being barracks. The Confinement Hospital, Louverture, for African Americans is to the north. So we see here. 1315 Duke Street is now the Freedom House Museum, which is dedicated to telling the story of slavery in Alexandria and those who experienced it here. At the museum, there's a scale model of the property about the time when the war began. Part of the auction house had a pen, which already looks similar to a jail. But kind of like in here, these two ways. This image shows changes that occurred once it was confiscated for use as a prison. The roof was added over the pen area. During its time as an auction house, there were separate men's and women's quarters, and the prison kept this arrangement. This prison held both Union and Confederate POWs. Many soldiers flocked to the slave pen jail to see evidence of slavery, especially Northerners who had only heard tales of it. We now see it in person. In Mercy Street, James Green was imprisoned in a slave pen-like jail for refusing to sign the Oath of Allegiance, so it kind of gets a shout out there. In this prisoner report from September 10th, we see that the number of escaped prisoners is left blank. However, in the row, we see a possible explanation for not listing an escapee as number 1. Escaped during the past 10 days, 1, but has been recaptured. So it's back to 0. No one escaped, so we got them. So that's why they're not counting it in the actual ledger here. Left it blank. I want to preface our last prison by stating that it is by far the most notorious and one where the cruelest treatment was experienced by the confined soldiers. It also was the largest, hosting over 1,500 prisoners at its capacity. The property at 515 North Washington Street is right next to Lee Fendel. It is now an apartment building. Apologies if any of you live there. I have given this lecture to someone in the audience who does live there, and they're like, oh goodness, my goodness, I did not know my building had this history. So my apologies for that. It had many owners before the Civil War. It was known as the Mount Vernon Cotton Factory right before, but it has no connection to George Washington. Primarily held Union soldiers suspected of desertion and Confederate POWs. It was meant to be a major holding facility for prisoners being transferred northward or out of the city. Once the war ended and prisoners were paroled, it became barracks and officer housing. So we can see how close the prison is to Lee Fendel. So here is Orinoco Street. So here's us. We're that little blob right here. And it was huge compared to the other ones. I mean, it covers pretty much the entire block this time. And then here's a zoomed in version for you guys. The main building was used to house prisoners, and parts of the cotton factory still remained untouched, so they still had the machinery in the building while it was a prison. We can also see how large the kitchen was to feed the soldiers. So labeled cotton factory was where the machinery was, but this is a very large prison compared to our other sites. This prison report from October 20th of 64 lists 1,274 total prisoners. Petit began his report by stating, great improvement has made in policing this prison and its premises during the last 10 days. Much, however, remains to be done to render it a model prison. Some provision should be made at an early day to warm the prison. Oh goodness. We see at the end of the report, however, a brief note as to how 18 prisoners escaped. The escapees are due to a want of vigilance on the part of the guard and improperly posting the sentinels. Look where this is listed. This is like an afterthought. These reports would be sent to the military governor, and he's like, ooh, by the way, we lost 18 of them. No idea where they went. Not my problem anymore. 11 days later, the total number increases by 200 to 1,000, or by 200 to 1,473. Petit does not have good things to say about its condition. This prison is not in a desirable condition. The larger percentage of prisoners confined render it quite necessary that the officer in charge should give his entire attention to the internal economy and organization of the prison. The prisoners require constant attention to keep them clean. While there are no escapes in this report, at the very bottom of the page, in incredibly small print, which I have blown up here because it was quite small, we see George W. Thompson, Company H, 7th Maryland Volunteers, was shot October 26, 1864, by the guard while grossly violating existing orders of said prison. I did research this Thompson and found out that he actually went by Henry. His service record listed him as deserted from Washington County, Maryland. So that's probably why he was being held at Washington Street Prison. He had actually deserted, and unfortunately he lost his life not respecting the prison rules. Here's an example of a monthly count for prisoners. Those receiving medical care, sent to hospital, or escaped, as well as information about the guards, in this kind of middle column, and then the prison's finances. Not every month had one, and we see this becoming more regular starting in January of 1865. Another really cool addition, starting in January of 1865, was a compiled list of the nativity of the prisoners. So we get majority of people from the United States, also a good number from Ireland. Believe it or not, we get people from Poland, we got Italy. They did list African-American prisoners as well at 66. Wales, 0. They still included it. Wales got 0. France, so kind of interesting to see where everyone's from. But they did document this. I'm not sure the reason, but they did. Okay. Next portion of our lecture will cover how citizens interacted with the military government and the tens of thousands of soldiers occupying their city. Even if the majority of Alexandrians welcomed the occupation and suppression of the rebellion, it would still be difficult to live side by side with an overwhelming military presence. I'd like to start off by reading this letter written by Charlton Lewis to his wife in August of 1863. He was the Deputy Commissioner of Internal Revenue in Washington and wrote about his impressions of Alexandria. My dear wife, today I went down to Alexandria and looked around, found 3 brigades of infantry, one of them regulars in the city, streets full of men asleep, lying on sidewalks, gardens and houses full. The city is almost deserted by citizens, crowded by strangers. Talked with a number of people, some of whom I had known years ago, but most of the old families are in Dixie. There were hundreds of primary sources, first-hand accounts, letters, diary entries, and newspaper clippings, and government reports to choose from to illustrate daily life under occupation. I have selected a handful I believe encompass the occupation experience and reality of the Civil War. For example, pictured on the left side here is a newspaper clipping from March '64, where the public is informed about the arrival of Negro troops, who are to be confined in the city's prison for a variety of reasons, just like their white counterparts. But the difference is these prisoners were announced ahead of time, specially announced so that Alexandria could prepare themselves for their arrival. Later that summer, we see there's a bulletin warning of thievery. Even though the city was in actual lockdown mode, it did not stop crime and disturbance. Thieves are about again. Last night, a yard was entered near the corner of Duke and Fairfax Streets, and a quantity of clothing taken from the lines on which it was hung to dry. Dr. Murphy's stable was entered and robbed of a full set of harness, etc. Other depredations were committed. Look out, people. Very strong word, okay? Julia Wilbur noted in 2 diary entries her impression of soldierly conduct in the city. So we see here a row occurred near the cars on King Street. Just as we got there, a crowd of civilians had collected, and one of them shot a soldier, it was said. We saw 2 persons marched away by the guard. It was a hard-looking crowd. And then, today, I have seen drunken, swearing soldiers. Last night at the ball in Chapel's Hall, there was a shooting, a fray. It is only a few yards from here. A guard of Zouaves is enough to demoralize any city. It is more disorderly lately. The colored folks still believe there are doctors here seizing and killing folks for dissection. From what I hear of the school at the barracks, it is a place where children should not go. Mr. Axe beats the children and jerks and throws them about in a rough and brutal manner. And the sanctimonious superintendent keeps such a man there. So, A lot of these reasons, such as disorderly misconduct, would get them arrested and sent to these prisons for such conduct. Speaking of soldier conduct, we got here a robbery. The residence of Mr. Benjamin Waters on Cameron Street was entered this morning at 9 o'clock by a soldier in an overcoat and hat stolen from the hall. Chase was given the thief, but he escaped. It is not uncommon for prisoners to escape, as we have seen. Some are able to blend into groups of meandering soldiers, while some, of course, were detected quickly. As we see up here, 2 Confederate soldiers, prisoners of the safeguard, attempted to effect their escape from the down train on the Orange and Alexandria Railroad yesterday evening, when near the Accoting Bridge by jumping off while the train was under full headway, but they were recaptured, one of them being severely injured by the fall. These guys literally jumped from a bridge onto a moving train to get out of Alexandria. It was that bad. And then we see down here, Julie Weber comments on the characters of the guards at the slave pen jail. Went over to the slave pen, such disgusting sights, saw something of the way in which women prisoners are treated. Did the mothers of these soldiers know how their sons are employed in Alexandria? They would come down here in force and raze the old slave pen to the ground. Shall I complain of the abuses here and be called interfering and meddlesome? Or shall I know of such abuses and be silent? Oh dear, oh dear. Not all citizens were supportive of the Union Army or even the Union cause. Most Alexandrians had voted for John Bell in the 1860 election for the Constitutional Union Party. Bell favored dropping the topic of slavery altogether and not letting the federal government touch it. Early in the occupation, we see this June 1861 clipping shows Confederate sympathizers in plain sight. Yesterday in Washington, as the captured Confederate prisoners were carried through the city, 2 young ladies who were, it is stated, observed to wave their handkerchief were accused of having done so in sympathy with the rebellion and were taken into custody by the guard and marched to the Central Guardhouse. Their names were given to us as Henrietta Neal and Adelia Neal. As the prisoners passed through Alexandria, there are said also to have been demonstrations of sympathy among the feminine portion of the population. So Alexandria is not getting good PR with that one. You also see on this right side here, more about, of course, discouraging enlistment. You see more about the charge of attempting to pass outside of the lines, refusing to take oath of allegiance, and being sent to the old Capitol prison. These are citizens of Alexandria who are being punished for expressing their views as such as they are. Okay, a lot of you guys are familiar with the Marshall House Hotel incident. The most notorious incident in the occupation's 4 years occurred at the Marshall House Hotel, which once stood at the corner of King and Pitt Streets, which is now where the Alexandrian Hotel stands today. The proprietor of the Marshall House had hung a Confederate flag from one of the gables after Union troops took the city. Colonel Elmer Ellsworth was tasked, along with other soldiers for support, to take down the flag from this establishment. After securing the flag, the owner of the hotel shot him and killed him. Colonel Ellsworth became the first Union officer to be killed in the Civil War. He was a personal friend of Lincoln's and became a martyr to the Union cause. The proprietor, James Jackson, was also killed in return fire. St. Paul's is still standing. It is located on South Pitt Street, closer to the Duke Street intersection. On February 9th of 1862, Reverend Kenzie J. Stewart committed the crime of omitting a prayer for the President of the United States and for the Union during the service. Union soldiers in attendance stood up, bayoneted rifles in hand, and grabbed Reverend Stewart by the arms, dragging him out of the church. He was arrested and in jail for a night before being released by General Montgomery. General Montgomery did write to Abraham Lincoln, being like, what do I do? Do I suppress this man of God for conducting his services as he pleased, or do I make an example out of this? General Montgomery decided to release him, but that church was shut down after that day and converted into a hospital. So no more services were allowed to be conducted there after that incident. After a series of incidents, scuffles, and conflicts, the military governor under John Potts Slough began issuing general orders and decrees to combat disorderly conduct and depravity. So, right as he assumed office, he had some very strict rules. All soldiers are required to be within their quarters by 9 o'clock. All places of business must be closed by 9:30. All persons except the provost guards and patrols and passing troops must be within their houses by 10 o'clock. All persons found within the streets after 10:30 p.m., with the exceptions named, will be arrested and put in confinement, citizens and soldiers included. This one you guys are going to love. Notice is hereby given that the order hereby issued prohibiting the sale or gift of spirituous, malt liquors, or wines will be rigidly enforced. All places of business will be closed after 9 o'clock p.m. All congregants on the corners will be dispersed, and no persons will be allowed on the streets after the hour 10:30. Sincerely, with love, Lieutenant Colonel and Provost Marshal Wells. Cannot sell alcohol to soldiers anymore. They ruined it for everybody. Because of how King Street became, honestly, this houses of ill repute, combined with bars on site, it just became a nightmare there. So they shut it down pretty quick. The following report was made to the Joint Committee on the Conduct and Expense of War. It exemplifies that since Alexandria bordered Washington, it was not free from the scrutiny and the heavy hand of government. Congress has examined the city's occupation several times for various reasons. In this 1864 congressional investigation, it details the conditions at the slave jail after allegations of prisoner abuse, specifically the abuse of female prisoners, as Julie Wilbur had described to us, was reported. So in this top portion, sorry that's so high up today, it says that the Joint Committee on the Conduct of War be instructed to inquire into the military administration and all its departments in the city of Alexandria, especially into the system of military police there established, and the place and mode of imprisonment and punishment, and whether punishments of a cruel and unusual character are not inflicted without authority of law in a place known as the slave pen in that city. And then in the middle part, in investigating the military administration of Alexandria, since John P. Slough has been in command there. So they're looking at General Slough and his heavy-handedness and his crackdown on the city and wondering if he's going too far. And then this bottom part I found particularly interesting. They informed him that they had just received information that the town of Alexandria was beyond the control of the then provost marshal there, and it was full of stragglers, and there was a great deal of drunkenness and disorder there, and that it was their desire that he should immediately assume command and restore order, and when it was restored, to preserve it. So John Slough had a mission to completely reverse the reputation of Alexandria, and maybe he went too far, maybe he didn't. All right. So part two of my research interests are also Civil War hospitals, which are so connected to the prisons. You can't talk about one without the other. During the course of the war, Alexandria was home to 30 military hospitals, one of the largest concentration of hospitals treating soldiers in the Civil War. Naturally, confined spaces and overcrowded jails led to outbreaks of disease and contagion. Lack of access to medical care, malnutrition, and want of clothing sent a lot of them to hospitals. We have two images here, some of the largest in the city. Mansion House, which what stood in front of the Carlisle House, was physically the largest one, largest capacity. And then the Wolf Street, which is one of the most pretty ones, you could say. Right, this was the home of Francis L. Smith, who became Robert E. Lee's lawyer after the war. We can see here a map of the city's hospitals from historic Alexandria. And I've overlaid a map of the prisons so we can see their numbers. We can see kind of where they were in relation to the hospitals. So here is the Lee Fendall Hospital, Grosvenor Branch, and you can see there's that big notorious Washington Street prison, and then St. Asaph's right here. So it became a big hub for this. All right, in this up close of our hospital, we can orient ourselves to the, oops, I'm actually on the wrong thing. There we go, okay, excuse me. This image actually is of post-war Lee Fendall in the 1870s, but much remains the same, including the cow, or cow. They did have cows wandering around Washington Street. So Lee Fendall was confiscated in April of 1863 by Dr. Bentley. He thought it would be a great place to have a hospital. Big rooms, tall ceilings, has a garden, has a porch, it's perfect. And so it is taken part of the 3rd Division. This map, right, shows part of that 3rd Division system. So it shows Grosvenor Branch, Grosvenor House, which Dr. Bentley was at Grosvenor House, needed room, branch of Grosvenor House, Grosvenor Branch. And then Queen Street Hospital is also hanging out here. So this is the one we kind of advertise a lot at Lee Fendel, especially for my hospital tour. And the close-up, we can see, here's our lovely elongated telescope style, right? We also see there's a sink on site, there's a pump, our porch, and a dead house in the far left corner of the garden. Now, when we say dead house, we mean as they did. This was a garden shed constructed for the purposes of housing deceased soldiers. It's not a morgue. There's no respect, there's no dignity. It's just a shed, unfortunately. This lithograph dates to 1854. We see Lee Fendel pictured here, and it's white. It is no longer white. It's a beautiful, stately, rusty brown, which is beautiful. Believe it or not, the new color dates back to 1850, which is the accurate color of the Civil War years. So this was put in later by residents in the 20th century, but this is this painting that was put over that. And then here is Washington Street Prison, right next door. And then of course our kind of dirt road Washington Street right here going down to the woods. Okay. Being adjacent to a prison meant that we hosted and treated a number of Union prisoners and Confederate POWs. Here are some of their stories. The following records were compiled from our own medical ledgers housed at the archives in DC and the military records of the patients highlighted in this lecture. I've corroborated as much information as possible to paint a picture of these soldiers, and I hope I can do their stories justice. I've selected them to embody the stories of many other soldiers with similar experiences. Most of the prisoners came to us between September of 1864 and April of 65. Interestingly, this coincided with two events. The prisoner exchange system came to a halt by 1864, so no one's moving, no one's being exchanged for other prisoners, and Captain Rufus D. Petit was appointed superintendent of U.S. military prisons that summer of 64. So there's a heightened amount of soldiers needing medical care once he becomes in charge. James E. Onker, or Onkers, I've seen it written both ways, was captured and sent to Alexandria as a POW. He was held in the slave pen with the intent to transfer him up north. Pictured here are the admission and discharge entries for Onker in our ledgers. The admission and then discharge. As well as information about his medical admission from his Confederate service record. Pneumonia. The surgeons admitted him as a POW directly onto the ledger, so they actually wrote it here, prisoner of war. Right there. Listed on the right-hand side of the slide, we can see his admission date of February 9th of 65 matches our ledgers, so that's very helpful to have the same dates across the board here. Now, it's unfortunate because Grosvenor Branch was often just categorized as Grosvenor House, but we were a separate hospital, so unfortunately a lot of the records get mixed up. But this is also Grosvenor Branch. We can also see here on March 1st, he is sent back to the slave pen and returned to prison when he was cured. Further along in his Confederate service record, we can see that he was transferred to the old Capitol Prison and then sent further on to Elmira in March of 1865. Place of residence, he says, Alexandria. That's because James Onkers was a local boy from Loudoun County. And when he finished with the war, he came back to Chantilly, worked at a grist mill, and is buried in Sterling, actually. All we know about James Williamson is that he was a supposed deserter, as listed on both his admission and discharge ledger entries. He did not voluntarily provide this information, which leads authorities to believe he is a deserter, since Williamson does not want to be fully identified or connected back to his regiment. Admissions would be forwarded to regiments so they could ascertain whether a soldier is missing in action, a deserter, or otherwise absent due to illness. So the hospital records would then be forwarded to their commander, their go-to in the regiment, their reporting officer, who would then put it down, oh yeah, you weren't just missing, you actually were sick. So we don't, punish you for that.
Take a question on that?
Mm-hmm.
So he's a Union soldier who's a deserter, and he's in a Confederate prison. Is he expected to survive the night?
No, that is a very good point. So none of the prisons in Alexandria were dedicated for Confederates or Union. They were mixed. So he's not in, he's coming from the Washington Street prison, which held mainly Union soldiers. There weren't many Confederate soldiers because they would just be shipped elsewhere. They weren't meant to be kept here for very long. Very good question. Okay. This entry particularly caught my eye since there are several interesting things about it. The first is being that James Walsh is a citizen. He's not a soldier. Civilians would need special permission to be treated at a military hospital. It's most likely that he petitioned Dr. Bentley directly as the head of the hospital, head surgeon. What is also striking is that we don't have a discharge entry, but note that our surgeons purposely wrote, returned to prison and admitted again, for what we can only imagine. They wanted to put that down. I classify Jacob Zimmerman as a Union deserter once I read his military record. It is not listed here, and many other Union prisoners do not have their conviction written on the ledger itself, unless it's in the case of a Confederate or someone like James Williamson who wouldn't identify himself. Zimmerman was one of the many to die here at the Lee Fendel House. Our ledgers do not specify in which jail he was held, but I suspect Washington or Prince Street based on his probable crime. Upon further research, I learned from the New York State Civil War death register that he died of scurvy, and that Dr. Bentley signed off on his certificate of death in terms of his service record. In my extensive research through the service records, I found many Jacob Zimmermans from New York, about 3 in total who fought in the 15th Heavy Artillery. Can you imagine having 3 Jacob Zimmermans in the 15th Heavy Artillery? It's a lot of them. Based on the age and muster dates, I believe this to be our Jacob. While we do not have a digitized copy of the record that we do for Anker, we can surmise that Jacob was, in fact, held in Alexandria jail for desertion. The final slide for our hospital admissions section is one I like to call honorable mentions. I could not find these 2 soldiers' service records. However, their ledgers deserve a shout out. William Gardner and Lawrence P. Carl, who apparently also went as Hoff, alias Hoff, were both returned to their regiments under guard according to the sentence of court-martial. This implies that these 2 patients were escorted from the premises and most likely went to Provost Marshal Wells's office to wait a verdict on their apparent criminal actions. So if you're escorted from a hospital under guard, you're not free yet. You've been treated, but you're still considered guilty of something, and you're going to have your verdict decided for you. When Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant on April 9th of 1865 in the living room of a farmhouse in Appomattox, Virginia, the war essentially ended. We know that's not the case. The war didn't end in April of 1865. Believe it or not, the war would not officially end until President Johnson declared it so in August of 1866. The largest Confederate army, the Army of Northern Virginia, put down their weapons and were paroled by Grant. In Alexandria, soldiers were starting to be sent home. Hospitals began to close. Confederate POWs were transferred to parole camps. In the final section of this lecture, we will examine how the city was returned to civilian rule and military laws dismantled. Pictured here on this slide is Alexandria National Cemetery in 1865. It opened before Arlington National and is the final resting place for close to 4,000 Union soldiers, some of whom, about over 50 of them, died at the Lee Fendel House. If you notice, these are wooden headstones. Do not last very long. I used to work at Arlington National Cemetery, and I'll tell you, the ones we're familiar with today are like this tall. It's very misleading. They're not this big. They're very big, and they go deep into the ground. And that would soon replace these very flimsy wooden ones. The most anticipated part of the lecture has now arrived. Captain Petit's cruel and unusual punishment has finally caught up to him when, in October of 1865, he was arrested, court-martialed, and later discharged from the military for his treatment of Union deserters, imagined or real. On October 30th, the Gazette reports, the Washington Star reports and the Gazette reprints, Captain Petit of the 12th Regiment Veteran Reserve Corps, keeper of the military prison at Alexandria, against whom charges have been preferred of cruelty towards prisoners entrusted in his care, will be tried before the court-martial, of which Major G. Green is president, Colonel H.B. Burnham, judge advocate. The Gazette will update readers in November of 65, a month later, that we are informed by the Washington Chronicle that the court-martial sitting in Washington did not take up the case of Captain R.D. Petit, 12th Regiment VRC yesterday, as some change is likely to take place in the organization of the court in consequence of orders having been issued to muster out a number of generals. Basically, the people who were supposed to be a witness at this trial went home. War's over. I'm not part of the army anymore. You're not calling me back to Alexandria. I'm back in New York. I'm back in Pennsylvania. I'm not coming down for this trial. They have witnesses for this. But finally, in January of 1866, Alexandrians are informed Captain R.D. Petit, 12th Veteran Reserve Corps, and Lieutenant Henry Menti, 42nd U.S. Colored Troops, have been dismissed from the service. Now, I'm not entirely sure what this other gentleman did, but we get confirmation that Petit is now out of uniform. Don't be alarmed, we're not reading all of it. Among the papers of Captain Rufus Petit was a longer letter from the commanding officer of Washington Street Prison to Provost Marshal Wells. This letter is dated before the war's end and addresses the accusations against not only Petit, but the care and oversight done by the staff at this prison. This is a heavy and lively letter that I wanted to read a portion of it to you. So he's noting originally that, hey, don't trust the guys writing letters because they are of the most depraved nature and have lived before this a life of infamy and crime, so they're not a good judge of character anyways. He's also saying, I felt it my duty to frequently as occasion demanded, to punish these ruffians, what a name, to punish these ruffians. And he called these scoundrels, right? These scoundrels either stopped in or punished for their rascality, have written long and doleful letters complaining of brutal treatment from the prison officials to parties outside of the prison who have not the remotest idea of the character of the writer or the difficulty attending government of the prison. We call this the ad hominem logical fallacy. They're attacking the character of the person and not their argument. So this guy wrote this really, really long letter. It keeps going. Really, really long letter saying all those allegations against Petit are nothing because these guys are criminals. Their voice shouldn't matter. Very respectfully, your obedient servant, H.H. Foster, Captain commanding the prison. The diary of Channing Moore Smith of the 13th Virginia Artillery provides insight into parolees who were either sent to Alexandria or they're on their way out at war's end. He surrendered at Appomattox with Lee. The two final entries of the diary, held at the Virginia Museum of History and Culture in Richmond, tell of his stay in Alexandria. I can't decipher what he gets a plenty of, but we see here we get a plenty of something, but for what reason we are detained here, I cannot say. And then later, the next day, it is a beautiful day and the church bells are ringing, but there is no church for us paroled prisoners. I suffer very much. So they're denied church services as they await their fate and return home. If you walk to Christ Church, a popular tourist destination here in the city for its association with the attending Washington and Lee families, you will notice a large mound by the fence. During the war, rebel soldiers were typically not allowed to be buried on federal ground. In other words, in Union cemeteries. There were many efforts after the war by Southern societies and memorial associations to establish official Confederate cemeteries. The following description is pretty haunting, but it emphasizes a key role that post-war burial played in perpetuating the lost cause here in Alexandria. So we see here, under this mound lie the remains of 34 Confederate soldiers which were disinterred from the Alexandria Soldier Cemetery, which is a national cemetery today, and reinterred in this ground on the 27th day of December, 1879, under the auspices of the Southern Memorial Association of Alexandria, Virginia. And then it lists, kind of in the middle section, all of their names here. And at the bottom, these men were prisoners of war who died in the federal hospitals in the city. So this really shows here that at this time, we're no longer under military occupation because it repeals laws and the curfews are reversed that were acted during wartime. So we see here, up here, the executive order removing all restrictions upon internal, domestic, and coastwise commercial intercourse will be found in our columns today. The removal of some former restrictions of a local character in relation to the sale of liquors, etc., announced in communication to the Common Council of this place by General Slough goes into effect today. they can sell liquor again. It's a very great day for them. All right, and on May 10th, down here, we see that Prince Street Prison is deemed empty. There are, it is said, but few prisoners confined at this time in the U.S. military prison on Prince Street. They're being shipped out, they're being transferred to other places. The city is kind of removing that lockdown mode it had earlier. And then lastly, this is a long explanation that if someone from Alexandria, a resident, felt like their property was confiscated without just cause, or they want compensation, they are now welcome to come forward and submit a claim to repossess their property. I provided a small list of events in the next few months at the Lee Fendel House and through Gravestone Stories that will further expand on and spotlight topics within tonight's lecture, including 2 of my handcrafted tours and another lecture scheduled in a few weeks. This next talk will focus on the hospital that was highlighted tonight in way more depth, with more discussion on the surgeons and the patients. And with that, I want to thank you very much for attending tonight's lecture. I will open for a Q&A if there is time, if anyone has any questions, but thank you so much. I appreciate it.
The typical Confederate soldier in Union prison, were they get like 1 meal a day, hardtack and water, or what would they?
That's a good point. There actually wasn't any type of discrimination in that way. Everyone got the same food. Because Alexandria was under the watchful eye of Washington, if there was even a word that they'd be treated differently, it would have gone back to Washington. It's a good question.
So what were they served? Basically 1 meal a day, or what did they have?
Probably 2 meals a day. It'd be like a morning and evening because there were cooks on site. A lot of contraband workers would work in these kitchens, as well as female volunteers who came to the city. So twice a day was normal, but if it was low rations, once a day would be normal, wouldn't be unheard of. Yeah. Yes, please.
Why were sections of text blanked out?
Oh, great question. I should have said that. It was irrelevant to what we were talking about, or it was just fluffy, 19th century language that was just very distracting. So I blocked it out to focus on the main points, not to hide information from you guys, but some of it was just irrelevant or included information from a previous thing that I just thought was distracting. Yes, please.
All right, yes, I think there was a large military hospital up in Virginia Theological Seminary.
Yes.
Did you include that in your presentation?
Yeah, so with this, I didn't look at all of the hospitals, mainly because there's an unfortunate lack of access to those registers. I am going to be working with the National Archives in DC to find the 29 other ledgers. But because I didn't have immediate access to the other hospitals, I couldn't have ascertained how many prisoners were held there. I have the benefit of working at Lee Fendel and having access to our ledgers, which has been like kind of a model for it.
The BTS, I think, was hospital.
Mhm. Yes, the Fairfax Seminary Hospital. Yeah, I did for a period of time. I believe it was part of the 2nd Division, if I'm not mistaken. I probably am. But yes, you're exactly right. It was part of the hospital system. Yes. Please, go ahead.
Did hospitals intermingle Union and Confederate patients?
They did, absolutely. So James Onker, who I highlighted, was in a cot right next to a Union soldier. The difference is a Confederate patient would be under constant guard. They would not be let free that way. They'd be either chained to the bed or they'd have an armed guard with them. But Alexandria, as big as it is, as many hospitals as it had, did not have the privilege of having separate hospitals. If you're sick, go where there's a bed. Very good question. Please.
Thank you so much for your wonderful research.
Of course.
The diary of the parolee, what he was getting plenty of, to me it looked like he was getting plenty to eat.
Ooh, okay.
I don't know.
We will. Yes, let's go back.
Just left out of me.
Not that far. Oh, here it is.
To eat.
Where am I watching it here? We're getting. Oh, to eat. You have solved the mystery that's been bugging me for kudos to you. A plenty to eat. You know what? That makes such perfect sense. You should be a researcher. Are you a researcher?
I am. And
There we go.
background,
That makes sense.
Sometimes we just need someone else to look at it.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Plenty to eat, everyone. It's been solved. Yes, please.
Were the Confederate civilians or Confederate sympathizing civilians, were they intermingled also with the Union Confederate troops, or were they given a separate facility?
Very great question. Most of them, I'm going to say about 75% left. They were gone. They would not stand for Union occupation. A lot of them went to Winchester, the Plains, or Richmond itself. There were some that remained.
I'm talking about those who were taken prisoner for one reason or
Oh,
another.
yes, most of those were because they were actively supporting secession through their financial support,
Were
or
they intermingled with the Confederate Union troops, or were they in a separate prison? Or?
no, because they didn't have special prisons for the citizens or for Confederate or for Union, because there were only 5. Maybe they put you in a special cell that was far away, but your safety was not their concern. That's for sure. Very good question. Yes, please.
I'm really curious about the process by which prisoners were transported into and out of Alexandria.
Yes, so this was in mass. It's a combination of being shipped by boat, by ship to the wharf, or by rail line. So if you can imagine, of course, most of the war battles were fought in Virginia. They would wagon them probably to those rail lines and then ship them, or wagon them to the coast and ship them up this way. It's just because it was the first federal kind of lockdown facility, the closest one in the Confederacy. Of course, as the Union moves south, there's more, but those cities that are occupied as the Union moves south are not military governments. They don't have this stuff already set up. Alexandria's had it set up since day one, and it's ready to receive people. And so it became the go-to, and then further up. Of course, Baltimore and Philadelphia also got people, but guess what? They have to come through us first. So we were also like a stop on this train for them. Very good question. Please.
They kind of related to that.
Yeah.
Who decided, how did they decide, who's going to go to which prison?
This is a mystery because I don't think they really had any battle plan with that. I think it was just space. Just like with the hospitals. You would have soldiers coming off the battlefield in wagons. All right, guys, there's beds here. You guys go there, and you guys go here. It really was space, to be honest with you, and the nearest one to where they were located. Good questions. Yes, please.
I'm curious about the protocol of military cemeteries
Yes.
versus the 16 Confederate soldiers. So early on, they were buried in the National Cemetery.
Yeah, they were. And then a lot of the uproar about it came from lost cause sentiment. We Confederate sympathizers or neo-Confederate sympathizers do not want them buried there. They deserve their own space for their valor. So a lot of that came post-war. It was not as big of it was in some areas, of course, but in Alexandria it wasn't a priority to deal with.
So they weren't kicked out, they were reclaimed.
Yeah, they weren't kicked out. This was something done by that Memorial Association on their own dollar in their own time. Great questions, you guys. Anything else, please?
Did you calculate a death rate?
Oh, that would take probably 20 years because it took me 2 years to transcribe Grosvenor Branch's ledgers, which only had 1,700 emissions. You can imagine with Mansion House that had a capacity of about, several thousand, what that could be. That would take a very long time. I did have access to the prison registers over the summer. They were quite overwhelming. I'm not exaggerating. They're about the size of this podium. So when you open them, it's like a big atlas. And you get all these lists, and you're like, where do I even begin? So I took photos of them. But it would take a big volunteer effort to transcribe, as you can see, this handwriting for that long. But that is an eventual goal, and I'll see you guys in about 20 years. And I'll get back to you. Yes, please.
Why did Christ Church accept those Confederate remains?
Ooh, very good point. I don't have a clear answer. My amateur historian opinion is because of their association with old-standing Virginia families like Washington and Lee, that at the time, Alexandria became a big center for the lost cause. As much as we don't really want to admit that, it did have a lot of post-war pro-Confederate sentiment, as we can see with the statue that used to stand just up the road. So it wouldn't surprise me that to them, either it was a neutral place to put them, or maybe there were some people at the time who were like, yeah, totally agree with you. Of course, it's not the Christ Church today, but back then, most likely. Yes, please.
I have a couple of questions. Just following up on that, Christ Church, is that private ground?
Yes,
Where,
Christ Church.
but I'm just surprised that, now they want to get name streets.
Oh, I know.
I mean, dig up these bodies and get them out of
This
there.
was 1879.
I know that's
yeah.
then, but we have craziness now here.
Yeah,
So-
also nowadays a grave is a grave. That would be a whole level of frustration and discussion if we have to move
They
bodies.
probably don't even know about it then. Second, that petite. what was
Yeah,
it?
petite, yeah.
So, did anything else other than being discharged?
Yeah.
Did anything else happen to him where they
Good
were
question.
just fine if they were?
When he was court-martialed, he was dishonorably discharged and went back home to his farm in New York, where he died a couple decades later. Being court-martialed does not mean you are arrested, or does not mean you serve time for it. You cannot be allowed to rejoin the military.
So even if you're doing bad things,
Yeah.
it doesn't matter.
It's funny because it's really situation. I mean, as of right now, off the top of my head, there is only one example of a Confederate officer, for example, being executed, and that was the commandant of Andersonville for his, what we would call today, war crimes at that prison. So believe it, it's hard to say it this way, but it wasn't that bad enough to imprison him or execute him. He was doing his job, he just did it badly, fortunately.
And my last question, the citizens, the interaction of what it means. So they had curfews.
Yes.
They were not allowed to say what they thought about things. I mean, it's very similar to these days, actually. And were there other things that were different because the military was in there?
Those were the main ones. Those were the big ones. I mean, there weren't, believe it or not, that was it. Those are really strict ones. But not selling liquor, having the curfew, limiting when businesses can be open, and confiscation. I mean, you had no say, really, if your house was going to become an office or a hospital. Even for those living there, they had the choice to stay there while their house was a hospital or an office, but most left. But if you were loyal to the union, if you didn't cause an uproar, if you just followed the rules, you were left alone. So the ones I listed were the main ones. There were some that were a week long about, not putting your trash out on the wrong day, little things like this because it made the street dirty. Wasn't worth mentioning, but there were some municipal laws, of course, that were enacted during the war too.
So the confiscation of property, was that just similar to every place except it was more property?
Yes. This happened across the South. I mean, it bypassed the Third Amendment, the quartering amendment that prohibited the federal government from taking your property and housing the military in there because it was a wartime measure, because it was a military decree. The 1861 and 62 Confiscation Acts would expire at the end of the war. So, as we know, during times of war, presidents have extreme power to bypass civil rights. So a good example was Japanese incarceration during World War II, right? So, a good question, but it was a common practice. Property is property. Great questions. Yes, please.
Yes. Although the Union Army occupied the city of Alexandria, the town of Alexandria, was there still a civilian government in place?
Yes, there was. It was not the same as it was before. The first mayoral, I never say that right, mayoral election was in March of 1862. There was a mayor. They didn't have any say in anything. It was for show. Nothing they could really do because most of the issues in the city really affected the management of the military aspect of the war. So the federal supplies, the rail line, disorderly conduct. The city could not punish or manage their own civilians at this time. So they were almost like a figurehead during this time.
But handling trash collection?
Yeah, basically. They did, the dirty work that the military governor did not feel like was part of his job duty, which was very minimal amount of tasks.
I actually had another question.
Yeah.
That was about the banking and money.
Yeah.
Was there any?
There was
anything-
disruption, mainly that the commerce shut down and a lot of banks closed, mainly because they lost business. It wasn't because the governor didn't want commerce. It's just a lot of their citizens were gone. They left, and no one really there wasn't any more economy or trade going on once you become an occupied city.
Did people lose the money that they had in those?
No, I don't believe so. I mean, I haven't
Nobody
studied
else
that
took
in
it
depth.
out, or-
I can neither confirm or deny that, actually. I do not know.
Thank you.
Yes, we have one more question here, and then we'll wrap up.
Yes, I don't know whether I saw it correctly, but it looked as if one of the Confederate civilians might have been incarcerated
Yes.
because he failed to sign the
Yep.
oath. Were people required to sign the oath of allegiance?
Yes, they were. It was a requirement for basically remaining in Alexandria. People like James Green were delaying it, and because, of course, signing it, it would be published and visible to everybody across the United and Confederate States.
Yeah.
So it was required to be a resident. You could leave, or if you refuse to leave, like James Green, you will be jailed.
Just in addition, real quick to that,
The Stabler Leadbeater business, we have among the documents, the owner of the business at the time was Mary Stabler Leadbeater. The Stablers are Quakers. We have her oath of allegiance to the Union, and we also have the passes that you were mentioning. We have where she would ask for a pass to go and visit family in the district. Those are among, and that business stayed in business throughout the apothecary, the drug business.
Through their loyalty.
The
Yes.
Quakers, they would have been
Yes.
abolitionists.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, they were abolitionists.
So I
yes.
assume they wouldn't have objected to signing the
No.
oath.
No.
Not at all. They did it,
Happily.
stayed in business.
Yes.
So we have all those records at the apothecary museum.
You guys asked fantastic questions, just like my high school students. I appreciate it.
Well, just wanted to mention, some people sign a code of honor instead of the oath of allegiance.
Interesting. I'll have to look into that a little
And
more.
that was where you promised you wouldn't support
Right.
secessionists.
Yes, I'll have to look into that role in Alexandria if that was even offered. It's very
Well,
possible that maybe it
Well,
wasn't
my
offered.
great-great-grandfather signed that.
Oh, he did?
Yeah, your story is amazing.
Oh, we have to talk.
You have to talk with
Yes,
her.
please. That'd be fantastic. I need to hear about that because I need that information then.
Well, thank you.
Thank you again so much.
As you leave, have a cookie, have a pretzel, something sweet to do.
And before you leave, just a reminder, again, our next meeting is October the 23rd at the Lloyd House. Not here, but at the Lloyd House. So with that said, I'd like to thank you all for coming tonight. Fantastic presentation. One more
Great.
round for